So with inverse kinematics, you define joint limitations, and by moving the end joint, Maya calculates the position for all of the rest of the joints. So let's do a quick example for this. Let's go back to our orthographic mode. And this time I'm going to go to the front view because I'm going to show you how to animate something like a finger. So fingers can move and rotate in certain directions, but they also have certain constraints. And we're going to define those constraints, and then we're going to create an inverse kinematic rig. So let's create our first our joints. So again, let's go to skeleton and create joints. And our finger has, let's say, 3 joints, and then maybe let's attach it to our wrist. So let's create 4 joints. So our wrist would be 1, and then our first joint, and then second, and then our third joint. And then this last joint, which doesn't really count, but it's the end of your finger. So again, our wrist can move in pretty much all directions, but then our fingers can really basically move forward, right? They're kind of limited to the sides and backwards. So let's create these definitions. If you look at the right, we have in our attribute editor degrees of freedom. So we're going to actually tell Maya that our finger can only move in certain directions. So our wrist can move in X, Y, and Z space, so we'll leave this as is. But then we're going to drop this menu down, and we're going to select our next joint, and then we're going to tell it that it can only move in this direction, right? And so this is Z direction, because if you see, while I rotate this, these numbers are moving. So if you're not sure which axis you're working with, you can always do this exercise to find out. So we're going to only give it freedom on Z, and we're going to uncheck X and Y. And let's go ahead and do that for the rest of the joints. Again, this last joint doesn't really matter because it's the end of our finger, but let's just leave it like this too. Okay, so now if we tried to actually go to perspective mode and we tried to rotate this, you can see that we can't rotate it in Y. We can only rotate it in Z. We can also not rotate it in X. That's because we've defined already these constraints. But we can even be more specific, because not only can we only move in this direction, but our finger can't really go backwards, right? And this joint either. Everything kind of claws down. So let's define that. So again, the wrist doesn't really have these limitations, but let's go to our first joint. And you can see here under limit information, if you drop this menu down, we can actually assign certain degrees so that we limit it to move in those degrees. So X and Y are already blocked off because we've checked these off. And let's create these limitations in Z. So bring this down, and this will be the minimum because we're working with negative numbers, and then press the arrow to move it to the minimum and check this mark. And now let's do the maximum. So let's say that this will be the maximum movement. So 35.90, and again press the arrow so that that becomes the maximum and make sure it's checked. So now if we try to move this, it can't go past these numbers. And let's do the same for this next joint. So first find the minimum, which should be somewhere in negative numbers, and then press the arrow to send it to the minimum slot and check this mark so that it takes it into account. And now let's find the maximum. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's okay. Let's send this to max and turn this on. And now let's go to the last joint and do the same. So maybe this will be the minimum. And this will be my maximum degree of rotation. So we've already defined the limitations for these joints, meaning Maya will know that it can't move past these degrees, and it also can't move in X or Y because we've turned these off. Only this can move in X and Y, right? So now we have to create our inverse kinematics handle. And to do that, we're going to go to skeleton, create IK handle, click on that, and then I'm going to close this so you can see what it says. So it says to pick a start joint for your handle, and your start joint would be this first joint, right, our wrist. So click on that, and then it says to pick the end joint. So the end joint would be the last joint. So we're going to click on that, and we've created now this IK handle right here. So now if I wanted to move my finger around, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see it, I don't need to actually control the rotation of each joint. I can actually move my last joint, and then Maya will calculate the way that every other joint needs to move in order to reach that position, right? So this is another way of animating things. And now let's try to create the skin for this. And I'm just going to do again this cylinder shape for it, and make this a small radius. And add plenty of subdivisions. So now I've attached the cylinder, and you can see, let's go to perspective mode. So you can see how different this animation is using inverse kinematics, right? You can see my joint limitations here. It's not bending anymore. So this is as straight as it can go. And then things start to bend. So this is sort of how a finger works. So try to experiment a little bit and see what you can come up with using inverse kinematics rather than forward kinematics. Just this last section, so you know, you do the same process where you select all of your joints, and then you select the skin for it, which in this case was the cylinder, and then you go to you go to skin and bind skin. And then since the IK handle is already connected to your joint systems, it's still going to be working with it.